with, so let's do some welcomes. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join us this morning. My name's Rachel Ferry-Jones and I work for the Planning Advisory Service. And this is one in a series of sessions that we're running with colleagues from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, MHCLG, on the recent consultation on the National Planning Policy Framework, NPPF. Hopefully you've been joining some of the other sessions with the Chief Planner and also with Michael Bingham from MHCLG and my colleague Shelley Rouse, where we had a look at the overview of the consultation on the NPPF. We're now running a series of deep dive sessions where we're looking at some of the policy content in a little bit more detail. So today's session is specifically on development around stations, density, policies on Greenbelt, and also we're going to touch on the golden rules. Would you mind moving the slide on, please, Becky? Little bit of housekeeping before we start. We have sold over 600 tickets. So given the high number of people on the call, we have switched to this town hall function. So your microphones are not on and your video cameras are not on, but hopefully you can see and hear us all okay. We are using the Slido function for questions and comments. You would have received an email from us over the last couple of weeks with details of the Slido. You've got the QR code that you can put your smartphone over to access, or there's a link that we sent through to you. Thank you to everybody who's made questions and comments so far. That's been really helpful. We will be leaving that Slido open for a week, so if you've got further comments and feedback following this session, we will continue to collect that. If there are questions that are in Slido that you also want to ask, please use the upvote because that helps us understand the most pertinent issues for officers. We will be having presentations from colleagues at MHCLG, and this will be followed by a Q&A session using those questions and comments that we've had in Slido. As you know, there's an awful lot of detail to go through. We will get through as much as we can and try our best. All of the comments, we're not going to get through all the questions today, so we will be packaging them up and sending them off to MHCLG as well, so they will see any of the feedback that you give on the Slido. And as I said, we're going to leave it open for the week. Next slide, please. We have a number of colleagues from MHCLG, so we'll be asking them to introduce themselves as they come over and talk to you about the different policy areas. And next. So the areas that we're going to cover, we're going to start with, it's always helpful because there's been quite significant changes to have overview of the NPPF proposals and the objectives overall. Will then be followed, as I've said, with a deeper look at those policies around development around stations, urban-suburban intensification, looking at the policies on density, Greenbelt and the golden rules. Thanks, Becky. Just pause for a moment for those of you who haven't had an opportunity to put your smartphone or put the link into Slido so that you can be giving your feedback in that. Thanks, Becky. And now I'm going to hand over to Amy. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. So I am Amy Brooks and I work at MHCLG as Deputy Head of Planning Policy. So I work on the kind of overall coordination of the NPPF. And I'm going to start the presentation by giving a very quick overview of kind of the purpose and main changes that we are proposing in this consultation before I hand over to colleagues to talk through the deep dives on stations, density and Greenbelt. Next slide, please. Perfect. So I thought a good place to start is why we're changing the NPPF. So we last updated the NPPF in December 2024 following the change in government, and those changes kind of focused on the immediate priorities of the new government. So we reversed some of the changes that were made in December 2023, and we also made some further changes in relation to housing and growth. But there is still an appetite for a broader change to the NPPF, kind of for two main purposes: to present national policy more clearly so that it is more user-friendly to all users of the planning system, and also to make national policy more rules-based, so to improve consistency in both decision-making and plan-making. And this was kind of rooted in powers established through the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act in 2023, relating to national decision-making, national development management policies. And whilst we haven't taken forward that specific power at this time, we have taken forward some of those principles, and that is to introduce new specific policies for decision-making at the national level. And lastly, through this consultation, we're also looking to take further opportunities to support growth, so across different sectors. Next slide, please. And what does that mean in practice? So from the outset, we have established some very broad kind of drafting principles to inform the rewrite of our national policies. And I think one of the kind of most important things to note is that whilst the NPPF has been completely redrafted and it does look very different. Oh, I've lost the slides. I'll pause. Perfect, thank you. So whilst those policies do look very different in our new NPPF, we have in the majority of places looked to retain the existing policy intent, but make clearer in redrafting whether it applies to decision making or plan making. And in kind of drafting these decision making policies, there has been an important balance to strike. We have kind of firstly look to fill any gaps in the framework to make sure that our DM policies are comprehensive and robust, and they cover kind of common DM issues across England, so that we have these decision-making policies at a national level and they don't need to be replicated across all local plans. But at the same time, we've made a conscious effort not to try and cover everything. So we haven't tried to cover every single DM consideration, because we recognise that there are some aspects of policy that are locally specific and they do need to be covered in local plans. And then lastly, the kind of other key principle is to make sure that the new NPPF is reflective of the new plan making framework, which is coming into place soon. And that's kind of reflected in our transition arrangements as well, that this new NPPF in terms of plan making will apply to the new plan making system. Next slide, please. And then just to cover the big changes, these are both presentational as well as policy based. So something I'll touch on more in the next slide is the structure and the separation of decision making and plan making policies. We also have some reordering of chapters. So the climate change chapter has been integrated into the sustainable development chapter up front, just to show how they are kind of aligned and embedded in the planning system. And then we also have new policy and new chapters on energy and water and public protection. And then on the policy side, the biggest change around the presumption in favour of sustainable development, alongside our new policies on development inside and outside of settlements. And I think these policies really demonstrate our move to a rules-based approach, with the policies setting out that development inside of settlements, there's a clear in-principle support, subject to some exemptions. And then outside of settlements, we've set out where some forms of development and land use may be acceptable. And one of the last kind of big changes to flag here is that there are some aspects of policy that we are proposing to bring into the framework. So this includes the incorporation of the PPTS, so planning policy for traveller sites, embedding that into the framework. And we're also looking at bringing some of the key aspects of PPG into the framework, so those policies that are essential to the operability of the framework. And we're proposing to bring in the standard methods, the grey belt identification and flood risks vulnerability tables. Next slide, please. And just to talk more to the presentation of the framework, we've started with a clearer introduction to set out how the framework should be used in plan making and decision making, and also its interaction with other policy guidance and other regulatory regimes. And we've then followed this by our procedural chapters. So we have a chapter on plan making and decision making, and then all of our thematic policy chapters. And each chapter has been reformatted, as you can see from this screen grab on the right, with the example of climate change. We have a brief objective up front, which is contained in a box, and that is not intended to be policy in itself, instead to provide context on the policies in the chapter and the kind of intended outcomes. And each chapter has been got its own set of plan making policies and its own set of decision making policies. We're also proposing to move away from our paragraph approach into having individual policy titles and individual policy numbering. And that's partly to make it clearer and support that kind of usability, but also to improve the resilience of the framework, because we know that in the past, every time we change, add or remove an NPPF paragraph, everything changes. So trying to have those discrete policies for reference. And two things that we are still kind of working on are considering how we can assimilate footnotes more fully into the framework, and also how to improve its digital presentation when it is published. So again, to try and help make it user-friendly. And there's also a couple of points. Oh, sorry. Let me go back. Thanks. I just wanted to quickly flag on the annexes. So as well as the kind of incorporation of PPG, we also have some annexes setting out our proposed transitional arrangements, our list of written ministerial statements and other policy that we think will be superseded by the updated policies in the framework. And we also have updated the glossary. So there's some kind of new and amended terms, as well as carrying across old terms to reflect new policy in the framework. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the final point I want to cover briefly is the procedural policies. So chapter 2 covers the plan making procedural policies, and chapter 3 covers the procedural decision making policies. And as I've mentioned, the plan making policies relate to the new plan making system, and they aim to set out more clearly what the expectation is on the role of each plan, what it should contain, and how it should be prepared and examined. And that's for plans at each level. So we have our kind of local plans and neighbourhood plans, but also those new plans in the new system, so things like SDSs and supplementary plans. Also worth noting, we have some revised policies on cooperation, which are intended to replace the duty to cooperate. And we're also proposing a new policy, PM13, to clarify kind of where local standards should and should not be set in local plans. And then on the DM side, the aim of these policies is to encourage a more proportionate approach, so making sure kind of there's consistency and standardization in the way that applications are prepared and determined. And within that, we have kind of policy on information requirements, on approaching decisions positively, and also on the relationship with other regimes. And then across the plan making and decision making policies, we also have set out some policy changes on viability. And that is a very high level run through of the kind of key broad changes in the NPPF consultation package. I will now hand over to one of my colleagues to cover stations. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Amy. Hi, Matthew.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Matt Spencer. I'm one of the team leaders in planning for housing at MHCLG. And I'm going to talk, along with my colleague Fergus, briefly about the building homes around stations policy, which we are consulting on in the NPPF consultation. So this policy was originally trailed in January 2025 in a speech by the Chancellor, which revealed government plans for putting homes near commuter train stations. The government wants to increase housing supply and deliver more homes in locations that are sustainable and locations which have good access to jobs and services, and train stations and rail stations were identified as a potential location for this. So the policy that we're proposing in the consultation has two main parts. The first, the big one is what we're calling an in-principle support in national policy for housing or mixed-use development within walking distance of well-connected stations outside and inside of settlements, including on greenbelt land. So there's a few kind of things that we can dive a bit deeper in today. So my colleague Fergus is going to talk about what well-connected stations means in the next slide. It's worth noting that this includes rail stations, that's National Rail, underground, tram, and light rail stations. We're also consulting on whether to extend that to other types of transport hubs. And there are questions in the consultation about that, and we welcome views on that. The policy applies inside and outside of settlements, including on greenbelt land. And we'll talk more about what that in principle support actually means later on in the presentation. The second part of the policy is a minimum density requirement, which we have set out in national policy. There are kind of two tiers to that. The first one is a minimum density of 40 dwellings per hectare around all train stations in England. So that applies whether or not the in-principle support applies. So that applies to all train stations, regardless of whether they are considered well-connected or not. And then around those train stations which are considered well-connected, we've set out a slightly higher minimum density requirement of 50 dwellings per hectare around those stations. So what's the aim of all this? So as I said, train stations can land around train stations can provide sustainable locations for housing development. They have usually good access to jobs and services and the things people need day to day. So we're looking to maximize opportunities for those sustainable developments and make the most of these areas with high levels of connectivity and improve access to jobs and services. I'll pass over to Fergus for the next slide.
Great, and I'm going to just sort of talk about what we mean when we say well-connected stations. So as Matt spoke about on the last slide, this is that subcategory of stations for which we are proposing the 50 dwelling per hectare minimum density, and those which will benefit from in-principle support for development under policy S5 when they're located outside of settlements. So as Matt said before, it's not just train stations. That's what a lot of the sort of kind of announcement and coverage and so on has spoken about, but it also includes tram, light rail, and underground stations. And actually, I think something like 2/5 of the stations that currently fall under our definition of well connected are on those kind of non-mainline train systems. And that sort of has a kind of spatial impact as well, sort of concentrating it in and around kind of larger cities where those systems exist. And then there are two kind of specific criteria for how you filter out or filter in certain kinds of stations that we want to, or that we think are more capable of kind of supporting growth around them in housing. So the first is that it has 4 or more departures of trains or trams per hour. So that's in all directions, not just in one direction, just to account for all sorts of edge and interesting cases. And importantly, where there's the sort of agreed possibility of those frequencies becoming higher, when that's agreed with the rail operator, those stations would also be in scope. So we know that in some cases there'll be stations that are served infrequently, and the prospect of kind of a reasonably large scale of development around them would mean that frequencies could be improved. So it sort of helps create a bit of a virtuous circle in some cases. Won't always be the case. Sometimes there'll be other constraints, but where the rail operator agrees, we're proposing that those could be brought into scope. The second kind of big criteria in defining a well-connected station is that it's in one of the top 60 travel to work areas. Those are defined by the Office for National Statistics based on kind of commuting patterns. So it's places where most people who live there work there, and most people who work there also live there. So it's kind of self-containment economically. And we think that the top 60 sort of strikes the right balance of capturing kind of a wide range of economically larger kind of centres, towns and cities, which cover, quite a lot of places without incorporating too many where there's maybe a bit less possibility to travel into the main centre by train. But importantly, this is the sort of definition we're proposing, and we're really keen through a few specific questions in the consultation to understand how that might play out in specific places, whether those sort of parameters that we've got there could or should be changed, and so on. I think I'm handing back to Matt then for the next slide.
Sorry, struggling to find the mute button. I think there should be another slide on stations, Rich. Maybe the next one. I don't know if these have got mixed up. No. Okay, well, I can talk about what was going to be in that slide, which is specifically where the policy applies. So the kind of it's an in-principle support in national policy, which sort of applies at all times. So that means that this in-principle support applies regardless of the local authority's HDT score or 5-year housing land supply or plan status. It is an in-principle support in national policy. It's not an automatic yes. So permission is still subject to all the other policies, which are material considerations, transport assessment, flood risk, all of these sort of things. It does apply on greenbelt land, as well as greenfield and brownfields and anything that's around the well-connected stations. We believe there is still a role for local plans in this policy. So one of the things that we're asking local plans to do is set higher minimum densities than what we set out in national policy, if the local authority believes that that is appropriate for that area, and also set minimum density standards for other areas that are not captured by the stations policy. So that might be around key bus corridors, town centres, city centres, and other areas that can support high density growth. We also recognise that in any definition which we set out nationally, we're not going to capture, every transport hub which is suitable for this sort of development. So there will be stations that are suitable which don't fall under our definition. There will be bus terminals and hubs that don't fall under our definition. And so we ask that local plans try and identify those opportunities for sustainable transport-led growth as well. And we're consulting on whether we can, we don't know if our definition, which we're consulting on, is perfect. So we are consulting on whether other transport nodes should be included, whether we should widen or constrict the number of travel to work areas, which we include, the frequency thresholds, the density standards, etc. So there are specific consultation questions on all of those aspects. There is also a kind of general protection in national policy for sites which have kind of long-term plans for regeneration. So that would also apply to sites around stations outside of settlements. And I think that is that covers the policy proposals on stations, and I'm passing over to my colleague Harry, I think.
Thank you, Matthew and Ferguson, and apologies for the confusion with the slides. We'll make sure that that slide is included in the materials that are published on the PAS website. Thank you, Matthew. Hi, Harry.
Yeah, hi, Rachel. Thanks very much. So hi all. So my name's Harry Palmer, and I'm one of the policy leads here at MHCLG. On this slide, I'll be taking you through some of the new policies in the effective use of land chapter relating to driving urban and suburban densification. So you may recall that back in September 2024, we published a Brownfield Passport policy paper that kind of set out a range of ideas for making better use of land in urban and suburban areas. So since then, the policies that we're now consulting on build upon the high-level ideas within this working paper, and the key policy changes include support for redevelopment of corner plots and other low-density plots, support for upwards extensions and infill development, including within residential curtilages. There's now an expectation that residential development should contribute to an overall increase in local density. There is clearer expectations for authorities to set minimum densities in well-connected locations, and there's also a new policy to support residential extensions. So these policies are aimed at making the most of land in urban and suburban areas to support higher density in sustainable locations with good access to services. So the policy proposals kind of recognise that although the form and character of urban areas does vary significantly across different places, we do still think that there's common opportunities across different locations to support densification. Within these policies, we've built in safeguards to kind of prevent inappropriate development being brought forward within residential curtilages, to avoid an over-concentration of development, and to ensure that local infrastructure isn't placed under unacceptable pressure as well. And I will now be passing over to Tom for the slides on the Greenbelt.
Thank you, Harry. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks all. Yeah, so hi, I'm Tom. I work on Greenbelt planning policy as well as policy in relation to diverse housing. You've heard about the kind of major Greenbelt intervention that's in this consultation, i.e. the proposals for development of land around stations, which I think are sort of the most significant of the Greenbelt policies that have sort of been included in this round. You know, I won't sort of repeat the logic behind that there, but I think kind of important to note that kind of we see that as quite a targeted intervention into Greenbelt policy that's really kind of aimed at supporting that wider policy aim of maximising sustainable development in the most suitable locations in the way that you've heard about in the past couple of slides. But I thought it might be worth also going through some of the other changes to Greenbelt policy that are involved in the consultation. Some of these will be, a series of smaller, more piecemeal changes rather than kind of like one policy that I'll take you through. So kind of as I've got on the slide, and as you'll be aware, the December 2024 NPPF introduced some quite significant reforms to Greenbelt policy, including the concept of grey belt and various reforms around that. We haven't sought to, we don't see this version as kind of making major changes to that, or as kind of particularly retesting the effect of those changes. But we have made a series of changes that we think will help to improve kind of the operability of the policy, kind of in line with the sort of stuff Amy was saying earlier around that general approach, the general goal of this NPPF refresh of clearer rules-based policy and all of that. We thought there are a number of places where it might be helpful for us to come in and kind of clarify policy, make things explicit where they were implicit, and so on. Let's go to the next slide there. So I've flagged up what I think are key changes here. I'm not sure if it's a fully exhaustive set of, obviously, as you'll have seen if you've looked at the revised framework, there are a lot of wording changes in comparison to a typical NPPF refresh because of this sort of new way of setting things out. But flagged up some of the key changes here. So obviously we've got the policy of support for development around stations, which we've talked about. I think kind of perhaps the most significant one is our amendment to the grey belt definition, but I'll go over that in a bit more detail in the next slides. Kind of elsewhere, there are a few other changes which we think do help to kind of tighten up the existing policy. So kind of a clearer trigger for regular review of greenbelt land, building that into the plan process a bit more regularly. That's not necessarily meaning an alteration of greenbelt boundaries, but I think it does mean that sort of thinking about the greenbelt and thinking about whether the greenbelt is continuing to do its job is kind of a more regular and standard part of the plan process. We've got a recognition of the different roles of strategic development strategies and local plans in relation to greenbelt and greybelt. I think plans there are still, the local plans still are remaining the appropriate place to kind of be identifying specific parcels of greybelt and thinking about kind of designation and release of particular parts of land. But we kind of recognise that greenbelt is often a kind of more strategic designation that kind of can be better considered on a wider geography. So we've tried to sort of build in a role for the SDS in thinking about the strategic role of the greenbelt there and thinking about the kind of the greenbelt in more long term, while still leaving kind of the process of identifying greybelt and specific parcels to local plans. But kind of welcome feedback on that. I think you'll have seen throughout the NPPF there are places where we've tried to integrate SDSs, and I think interested in feedback throughout on that. We've got kind of sets of clearer policies in relation to establishing, assessing, and altering greenbelt boundaries. Kind of the existing NPPF arguably sort of moves back and forth between these concepts, kind of sometimes repeats itself in relation to these different things. And so we've tried to kind of set out in a slightly more programmatic way that process of kind of establishing a greenbelt, assessing existing greenbelt, and kind of drawing greenbelt boundaries as sort of distinct policies. That's another area where it kind of looks like it involves quite a lot of changes to the text that is currently there because of this goal of removing duplication and so on. So kind of interested in anything that we might have left out or unhelpfully sort of removed by accident in the process of that kind of translation exercise. We've got a clarification of categories in relating to not inappropriate development, so kind of trying to make more explicit, how inappropriate development relates to that concept of substantial harm, and sort of, this is a position that is not a change of position; it's already been there, but it's now hopefully a little bit more clearer on the face of the NPPF, as opposed to being something that kind of requires you to look through some footnotes and guidance in order to kind of gain the meaning of what we're trying to say there. And as part of that kind of that list that we have, which is now in GB7 of our categories of not inappropriate development, we tried to take an opportunity to sort of, clarify and reframe some of the wording around that. So you've got sort of, policies relating to reuse and extension, replacement of existing buildings kind of brought together in a way that's hopefully a bit more helpful. You have kind of some, introductions like, we've already had that policy in relation to transport infrastructure in the Greenbelt, then we've added electricity network infrastructure and water infrastructure to that, because it seems like that should be kind of treated in a similar way. So a few sort of smaller changes throughout that hopefully leads to a clearer set of policies, but again, welcome feedback on how those particular changes have worked. Existing NPPF, already in, is it 151 and 152 talks about, the expectations to plan for beneficial use of the Greenbelt. Again, as part of that move to a more rules-based NPPF, we tried to make that a bit more explicit than maybe the current NPPF has, and make that a bit more positive in terms of what it means to plan for beneficial use of the Greenbelt there. And we've got the inclusion of Greybelt guidance as a technical annex. You'll probably have seen this in a few different areas where some elements of the guidance we're proposing to move into a technical annex. Sort of recognise that, particularly the Greybelt guidance there is, something that's probably helpfully brought out of PPG and kind of into the framework as an annex. But again, welcome feedback on that. Let's move to the next slide. So I thought it might be helpful to go through some of the changes to the Greybelt definition in a bit more detail. This is something that's come up at a couple of the engagement events before, so it could be helpful to clarify. And also kind of the Greybelt definition does just sort of carry this weight and, interest, so I thought it would be good to go through this in a bit more detail. So I've got the kind of current NPPF definitions on screen, as well as an excerpt from some of our guidance. Current definition of the grey belt contains this explicit carve out in relation to footnote 7, where we say, if there is strong reasons why development should be refused or restricted, then it is not grey belt. So you had that interesting thing where the other footnote 7 criteria were relevant, not just for thinking about whether development should be approved on the site, but in terms of whether it counts as grey belt at all. This was obviously aimed at trying to make sure that we didn't undermine the protections from these other footnote 7 designations. But it kind of led to a few odd consequences that I've sort of started to touch on already. So it means, as I've said, that whether land is grey belt depends upon whether there's strong reasons for refusing a development for other footnote 7 reasons. And that means that it depends not just on the land. Whether something's grey belt is not about how it's functioning as green belt. It's not about necessarily the land there. It kind of depends upon the details of the specific development proposed. And that means that kind of whether land is grey belt depends upon exactly the details of the development is being proposed. It means you could only provisionally flag that it could be grey belt depending on what kind of developments come forward on it. Kind of particularly in green belt reviews as part of the plan, that made it difficult to identify grey belt with certainty. And also it did mean, again, that we kind of had a series of paragraphs in the PPG that were trying to make this a bit clearer, and it was definitely kind of leading to a bit of confusion, we thought. So let's move to the next slide to see how we've tried to address these points. So here we have our hopefully simpler definition of grey belt in the NPPF that's out for consultation at the moment, in which we've removed this explicit reference to other footnote 7 areas, and hopefully making the decision as to whether land is grey belt a bit more tightly focused on its contribution to green belt purposes. It's worth saying that is not necessarily intended to this is about the decision as to whether something is grey belt more than it's about the decision as to whether a development should come forward on that land. There's lots of reasons why something could be grey belt, but nonetheless it is right to not approve a particular development proposal on it. And those other footnote 7 areas are still very much built into that. They still very much do apply as they would elsewhere in the framework. But hopefully just conceptually it sort of draws a slightly neater distinction between the question of whether something is grey belt versus whether a development should be approved on it, whether there are other reasons set out in the framework that would count against that. I think that's the end of my bit on grey belt, and I'm handing over, is it Harriet, potentially?
That was really helpful. Thank you, Tom, and welcome, Harriet.
Morning, thank you. Hopefully that has now brought me on screen after my slight technical ineptitude there. Good morning, everyone, and I know others have said it, but thank you ever so much for finding time to join us on a chilly morning in January. My name's Harriet Beach, and I sit in MHCLG's Developer Contributions team, where I look after viability policy. I'm here this morning to talk through a little bit about the golden rules and how they intersect with viability. So to cover a little bit of territory that I'm sure will be familiar to many, if not all on the call, the golden rules are designed to ensure the development on land within or released from the Greenbelt delivers increased tangible benefits for communities. And that includes higher levels of social and affordable housing, green space, and necessary infrastructure improvements. At present, again, as you will know, where development takes place on land situated in or released from the Greenbelt and is subject to the golden rules, site-specific viability assessment should not be undertaken for the purpose of reducing developer contributions and including affordable housing. So that's kind of where we are at present. Now on to the changes that we are proposing. We're not proposing changes to the golden rules themselves. What we are proposing and consulting on is setting out 3 clear and limited circumstances where the use of a site-specific viability assessment may be justified to enable development in the Greenbelt. Those 3 circumstances, as at the bottom of the slide there, are for development proposals on previously developed land, for multi-phase strategic sites, and for development models that are of a wholly different type to those assumed in the viability assessment that informed the development plan. If we could move on to the next slide, please. Lovely, thank you. So that was sort of the what, and now a bit on the why. Why lift the restriction on site-specific viability assessment on development subject to the golden rules? Now, we know that different types of sites face different viability challenges. We also know that viability challenges can vary up and down the country. However, and we are consulting on this, we think the three circumstances we've highlighted are less likely to have been thoroughly tested at the plan making stage. In addition, previously developed land could involve higher remediation or preparation costs that can affect viability. And multi-phase strategic sites typically span a number of years. They require substantial upfront investment in infrastructure, and they may well face costs that were unknown at the plan making stage. Our aim in allowing site-specific viability in limited cases is therefore to provide flexibility where it's genuinely needed, whilst also preventing unnecessary negotiation on typical sites where we want to maintain certainty, we want to speed up delivery, and we really want to secure much needed affordable housing and infrastructure. Now, as you can see at the bottom of the slide there's sort of a rider in that kind of tealy coloured box. It's just worth noting that the proposed lifting of the current restriction on site-specific viability assessment on greenbelt land would work in tandem with a couple of other developer contributions and viability policies that have been mentioned in the course of this call. Amy mentioned up front, there's one in the plan making section at PM12, there's one in the decision making section at DM5, and then, yeah, as per this box, we sort of also linked to the consultation questions at Annex B, which covers standardised inputs to viability assessment. And the government would only implement the lifting of the restriction once wider proposed reforms are considered and finalised. There are also some additional policies that we are consulting on that would link to and support this. And those are on the next slide. So if we could skip forward one again, please, so we can talk through those. Lovely, thank you. So, linked to the proposal to lift the restriction on site-specific viability assessment on development subject to the golden rules, a bit of a mouthful, the government is asking consultation questions related to previously developed land, a potential affordable housing floor, and greenfield greenbelt benchmark land values. This is the slide where I'm sort of facing lots of three-letter acronyms, so hopefully I won't trip over my words too much. Kicking off with previously developed land then, here we are asking a consultation question about whether there are further changes to policy or guidance that could be made to help ensure site-specific viability assessments are only used for genuinely previously developed land and not predominantly greenfield sites. On affordable housing and an affordable housing floor, this is really about avoiding developments coming forward with no or very low levels of affordable housing. The government is seeking views on a minimum threshold or floor below which applicants should not seek to negotiate on viability grounds. Now, within this, we're considering two options, and all of this is set out in greater detail in the consultation document itself. The first of these options is a fixed national floor whereby a minimum proportion of social rent housing, such as 10% or 15% of the overall development, would be required for these developments unless otherwise specified in up-to-date development plans. So that's sort of option one under consideration. And a second option for your consideration and reflection is an affordable housing floor reflecting differing local circumstances. So, for instance, the Greenbelt affordable housing floor could be required to meet or exceed plan policies for equivalent land types and development types outside of the Greenbelt. Here, we're asking questions about, firstly, whether you agree with setting an affordable housing floor for schemes subject to the golden rules that are accompanied by a viability assessment. If so, what, in your view, is the appropriate appropriate approach to setting an affordable housing floor? So what's the right way to go about it? And then what would the right level for any affordable housing floor be? Thirdly, on to Greenfield Greenbelt benchmark land values. Now, you may remember that back in 2024, the government consulted on setting indicative benchmark land values for land released from or developed in the Greenbelt. The government doesn't believe that a national BLV would sufficiently account for variation in land values and types of land, and if set too low, would disincentivise landowners from bringing their sites forward. Nonetheless, there might be instances where further guidance could be beneficial to support compliance with the Golden Rules, as well as plan deliverability. This may be particularly true of greenfield land, which is typically more homogeneous than brownfield land in terms of its existing uses and its abnormal costs. We're therefore interested in the potential benefits of testing viability at the plan-making stage using a standardised national benchmark land value scenario of 10 times existing use value for greenfield greenbelt land. The purpose of this test would be to send a clear signal and ensure that plan makers have a clear and strong justification should they wish to adopt a higher benchmark land value. Here, we're asking whether respondents agree with local planning authorities and plan makers testing viability at the plan making stage using a standardised BLV scenario of 10 times existing use value for greenfield greenbelt land. And we're also taking the opportunity to ask whether you have any other comments on the use of nationally standardised benchmark land values for plan makers to test viability at the plan making stage. Lastly, just before I hand back to Rachel, I've mentioned a few other developer contributions and viability policies. So just to reiterate again, in case anyone is jotting them down and wants to look them out, those are at Plan Making 12, PM 12, Decision Making 5, and Annex B of the consultation document. And the latter contains wider questions relating to standardised inputs into viability assessment. We're looking to set up some further engagement on those topics. But in the meantime, needless to say, we would really, really welcome your views via the consultation form. Thank you ever so much, and I will hand back over to Rachel.
That's great. Thank you, Harriet, and thank you to all the team for those presentations. I think it was really helpful to have some of what we're seeing in the NPPF and in the consultation document unpacked. What was really clear is that MHCLG are definitely welcoming views and inviting views on input into those questions that are being asked. So I think the consultation document is as equally as important to go through in detail as the NPPF itself. They're the presentations.